Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Phillip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Callie Crosley is off. Tonight, the rise of race-based violence, hate, and discrimination. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We're working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. It's been a difficult week. The mass murder of 10 African Americans at a local Buffalo, New York supermarket in a predominantly black neighborhood has left people shaken at the act of violence and hate carried out by a self-proclaimed white supremacist who was inspired by the same racist theory that led to the massacre of 51 people at 2 New Zealand mosques in 2019. This perception of otherness toward people of color is widespread. When the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, African and Indian students living and attending school in the country found themselves in a war zone, facing racial discrimination while trying to get out of harm's way. We're told, according to reports, quote, to wait their turn, unquote, stand by and let white refugees escape the conflict. Here in our area, discrimination and neo-Nazism is on the rise. Incidents of racist propaganda and violence have been reported, including targeting local doctors, calling them anti-white for wanting to remove inequities in healthcare. How are people of color impacted by the rise of devastating race-based violence, hate crimes, and discrimination, both here and abroad? Joining us remotely, Iván Espinoza-Madrigal, Executive Director, Lawyers for Civil Rights in Boston. Dr. Sandra Matar, Clinical Psychologist, Assistant Professor, and Director of Training at the Immigrant and Refugee Health Center, Boston Medical Center. Dr. Clarence Lusane, Professor of Political Science and Director of the International Affairs Program, Howard University. And by telephone, Eva Castillo, Director of the New Hampshire Alliance for Immigrants and Refugees for MIRA, the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, worldwide, we're seeing some of these incidents in some of this discussion taking place worldwide because it seems to be a universal problem. But let's turn our attention right now to Ukraine. It's argued, and I believe correctly so, that the outcome of Russia's war, its invasion against Ukraine, is really the difference between expanded autocracy, frankly, worldwide, or imperfect democracies worldwide. Now, I'm sure we'll all opt for democracy, albeit its imperfection. Now, having said that, Clarence, is this the time to be focusing on racism in Ukraine and on its borders?
First, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be on with your other guests. It absolutely is the time because these issues are not separate. We can go back all the way to Martin Luther King, for example, who talked about the triplets of poverty, militarism, and discrimination. And we see that in this 2022 version around the world. One of the things that I think has been a important outcome of what's happening in Ukraine is that it's focused the attention to the world that Europe is not all white, and that in every part of Europe you have people of color, whether they're people of African descent, whether they're from Asia, whether they're from other communities. And so these issues are inescapably linked. And what we saw in Ukraine is as Russia invaded, it brought to focus some of the issues that people of African descent are facing in Europe. Every single country, there are skinheads, there are neo-Nazis, there are white supremacists, including Ukraine, but also including Russia, which has gotten almost no attention. However, there are differences in terms of whether in these countries, white nationalists have pretty much a free reign or there's some constraints. In Ukraine, while there are white nationalists and extremists, it is not what Vladimir Putin's claimed that they were essentially running the government. And in fact, in all of the countries in Eastern Europe, probably the safest was and remains Ukraine. Russia is extremely unsafe not only for people of African descent, but a lot of people were there from the Caucasus, a lot of from different Asian communities. And Russia is notorious for the degree of violence against people of color.
And yes, I mean, you make a good point. In Ukraine, you have something called the Azov Brigade, made up of current and former white supremacists. But it's not the country that's being run by the Azov Brigade. You have in Russia the Imperial Movement, which is also a fascist movement, but actually considerably larger, I understand, than the Azov Brigade. Let me turn to another topic, which is what happens when Ukrainians come to the United States. In March, President Biden welcomed about 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States, lifted Article, I think Title 42, I think it's called, and or I should say made exceptions for their arrival in the United States. And you also have the designation of a temporary protective status for many Ukrainians. I think 42,000 currently live in the United States. So, Eva, how does that juxtapose, if you will, with the status of other immigrants coming here and seeking asylum? Those, for example, from the Northern Triangle, those who might be coming from Haiti, so on and so forth. How does that juxtapose?
Well, it's typical of the hypocrisy of this country that we get to pick and choose who gets admitted here and who has an easier path, if you will. It took forever to get countries like Venezuela. Cameroon just got designated as a TPS country, but they, like you say, they made an exception for Ukrainians coming with Title 42 when we had tons of brown and black people, Haitians, Latinos, waiting forever to get their chance to come to here and present their cases in court. Yet we lifted those sanctions to allow the Ukrainians to come. So that speaks very loudly about what the priorities and the values of these nations are, that yes, we do have what we're supposed to all men be created equal. Equal is not equal for everybody.
But yet, Eva, and I'm going to ask this question to Iván in both a legal context and in response to something you just said, Eva, you still have TPS that has been extended to about 75,000 Afghans living in the United States, and TPS has been extended and renewed for about 40,000 Haitians in the United States, if I'm correct. Doesn't that suggest a level of equity?
Absolutely not.
Really, because it's taken a lot of time to get them. Look at the Cameroonians. They just basically just got it last month or so, So it takes a lot of work to get things done if you're a person of color,
right.
If, there's any type of path. Yet we made it easy to accept people that look like, the majority of the U.S. that wants to be white and it's a white country. So
and Eva, it seems
people
like,
identify closer.
Right,
Yeah.
Eva, it seems like, Iván, you were agreeing with what Eva's point. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to agree. And I think we tend to compartmentalize these issues. We tend to think what happens in Ukraine doesn't affect us here. And far from it, what we are seeing in Ukraine, especially with the treatment of communities of color, that has an impact directly in the United States. These moments of crisis exacerbate and reinforce historical inequities. It reinforces historical prejudices, who we perceive as being deserving of humanitarian relief. And so we open the door to Ukrainian immigrants while simultaneously closing the door on Black Haitian immigrants who are at the border and trying to come into the country and who need the same type of protections as other immigrants. And so this idea of picking and choosing who we allow in is deeply problematic because it's embedded with notions of race, notions of who deserves legal protections, who we should be saving, and in what order we should be saving them. And that is embedded deeply with notions of race. And so it's it's no surprise then that we see both in Ukraine and in our border, the southern border of the United States, these dynamics at play, where in Ukraine, people of color are being told, go to the back of the line, we're going to save you last. And in the US border, we are seeing similar dynamics of Black Haitian immigrant families being rounded up like slaves and cattle in images that are horrifying, while we make exceptions for other immigrants from countries that we consider to be more deserving. And I want to underscore that this is happening now with this particular crisis in Ukraine, but as you alluded to, Philip, this is a global issue, concerns surrounding anti-Blackness in particular.
Iván, and I think we're going to follow up on this in just a moment with all four of you to talk about how this plays into this notion that is being promulgated worldwide of a so-called great replacement of whites, whether it be in France or the United States. But right now, I'd like to ask Sandra this question about trauma. It is, when you see folks, as you say, stuck in Ukraine, Black Indians, Afghans, in some cases Iraqis, who have been living in Kiev for years and have been trying to make their way to the border and then find themselves in Poland or Hungary and other countries and still facing discrimination. And then you also see a situation where Haitians, for example, are fleeing violence there. Salvadorans are fleeing violence in El Salvador, the gang violence and so on and so forth. And this brings up the question of trauma. We've seen the trauma inflicted upon Ukrainians. What about the trauma also being experienced by groups in this country who we are no longer paying that much attention to? What's been your experience right now, Sandra?
Well, it's interesting. Thank you again for having me in the show. It's interesting how the war and what's happening with Black immigrants in Ukraine reverberates here, as Iván mentioned. I happen to work at the refugee clinic at Boston Medical Center, and 90% of my caseload are asylum seekers and torture survivors from Africa. And so in therapy now, what we're talking is we're talking about the images that they're watching in the Ukraine and how scared and vulnerable they feel that, as one patient told me, that could be me. And that could be me is their experience here in the US of how they are starting to feel when they arrive. They experience a certain kind of treatment that they had not experienced before on average in their countries, because they were the majority. And that feeling of being the other, it's utter betrayal. It's such a disappointment, because they come to the US with these ideas about what the US means and the freedom that they are entitled to in the US, and that they can walk as free citizens here, and yet they experience a differential treatment. And so it's no surprise what they see there in the news and what they experience here. And that adds to the idea of institutional betrayal, right? And the idea, there's this sort of moral injury that adds to their symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, their symptoms of major depression, their symptoms of anxiety disorder. It's really very complex.
And we've seen that trauma play out around the country. This country, we've seen it play out around the world. As Iván said, we're experiencing particularly anti-Blackness that's being manifest everywhere, and so on and so forth. But other people, of course, are also feeling the trauma. The trauma, for example, the reverberations from this shooting, this murder, this massacre in Buffalo this past week. And that otherliness is being amplified by this notion that has been advanced initially by this French theoretician and novelist, Renaud Camus, not to be confused with Albert Camus, in essentially saying that white people are being replaced by other people that are being arranged by this Jewish cabal around the world. How have you seen this play out, this great replacement notion that's proliferating through our society, from cable news to social media. And let's start with you, Clarence, and let's talk to all our panelists with the same question.
So this is not just a theory, but it's a call to action. And for white nationalism and white supremacists around the world, they have not just read this theory and circulated it, but have tried to implement it. We can go back to Norway, for example, in 2011, when Anders Breivik blew up a building, used that as a distraction to then go to an island and then murder almost 70, mostly young people. All of this was driven by this broad notion that Islam and people of color are invading Europe, and they're being collaborated with by weak leaders. And so the attacks on these particular political party was to try to push that kind of agenda. It was in the context of arguing that this replacement is happening. And so he issued all of that in a manifesto. And so what we've seen following that, New Zealand and elsewhere, are picking up this thread. New Zealand, I feel particularly linked to about a year before the killings at the two mosques. I was in New Zealand giving talks, and I gave a talk in Christchurch at a high school. And some of those students that I talked to were killed by this murderous rampage that was carried out. And so we see this happen again and again. One thing I would underline in these manifestos, and I've tried to force myself to read through them, is that they not only talk about this replacement theory, but they also cite the people around the world, including in the US, who are articulating this, that are considered mainstream, from Tucker Carlson to others, are get name checked because they are promoting this theory. They may not use the necessarily extremist language or racist language, but they certainly push it. And that goes from the bottom up to the top, including, I would add, Donald Trump.
Yeah, speaking with students who have been experiencing this on campus, they all cite Donald Trump as the provenance of this current manifestation, but this has been going on in some ways for years. Examples include the Chinese Exclusion Act, eugenics, so on and so forth. Sandra, the trauma that's emanating or resulting from this type of promulgation of a theory and a call to action, as Clarence mentioned, how are you seeing that in treating your clients, if you will, and people who you work with in a broader sense?
Yes, thank you. By the way, Dr. Hussein, I was in Norway when that happened. I still remember the sound of the bomb, of the building exploding, and the theories that this was a lone wolf. And there are no lone wolves out there. This is more a concerted effort to I believe, white supremacist effort to other people of color and portray them as a threat, as a threat to their existence. And but going back to your question, certainly, as I mentioned before, there's this idea that I cannot be safe in my body and I cannot be safe in my own country. And so what does that do to your mental health? You are on hyper alert, hypervigilance constantly, which are the clear, some of the main symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. You suffer from racial-based traumatic stress, and you cannot be at ease. You cannot even breathe at ease. So this has significant implications to your sense of safety in the world, your sense of identity, your sense of trust, and functioning out there in the world. And so there is no place where you can feel safe, except for a few places in your community. And that has significant implications to your health, right? To your lifespan, to your sense of well-being.
Without
certainly
question.
Is a health. problem. Yeah.
Without question. And Iván, that very point, you have been, and the Lawyers Committee have been working on a number of cases where this otherliness, if you will, and where has manifested and where folks feel they are reacting to the notion that they're being replaced, so therefore targeting folks who you work with. Can you talk about that?
This notion, like you mentioned, Philip, is certainly not new. I mean, we're all familiar with discourse going back, for example, which is really horrifying, about this concept of anchor babies, or all of these different ideas and notions that are seriously problematic. In some ways, they are a backlash to the demographic growth that has been happening organically in the country as the country continues to diversify, as people of color continue to have more visible leadership roles. And that is the backlash. And that's confirmed not just through the anecdotes of the work that we do and the client stories and experiences at Lawyers for Civil Rights, but also by federal authorities. FBI statistics confirm the sharp increase in hate crimes based on race, based on religion. And so this isn't an issue of perception of insecurity along the lines of what Dr. Luzon or Dr. Mata are talking about. This is concrete fact. This is objective. It is measurable in terms of the number of incidents where violence is being perpetrated. And that is skyrocketing across the country, including in Massachusetts. And so we've been at Lawyers for Civil Rights very actively working to protect victims of hate crimes, demanding accountability and justice, demanding complete investigations. Law enforcement is often very lax about this in a way that frankly perpetuates and continues to encourage, in a way, because it fosters a climate of impunity. And so if you don't send a clear signal that this is not tolerated, that you will be prosecuted for attacking violently somebody for speaking Spanish in public, or attacking violently someone based on their identity, then we're going to have a proliferation of those incidents, or worse, as we saw in the massacre in Buffalo.
We did indeed.
And so we need to do a lot more legal action, but also push the federal authorities to take these matters seriously, send a signal across law enforcement.
In a second, I'm going to also ask the four of you, within just a few minutes, to talk about possible ways of pushing back against this concept of replacement. But Eva, finally, in this vein, in the context of this stream, can you talk about how the people you work with, immigrants, have basically been affected by this, the notion of being targeted?
Well, it has affected all of us, including myself. I could pass for a white person, yet, you know, I'm subject to the stereotypes and everything. If I use my married name, people with my married name treated me much better than Eva Castillo. And it's just a matter of perception, like somebody else in the panel said. We're not worthy of having equality. That affects, I have a Mexican son, and I see how he's being targeted for just being who he is in a store compared to my white kids. Whenever I went to the big stores with him, they would, you know, tag along him to make sure that he was not shoplifting. That never happened to my own son. And with myself, I'm so terrified that I carried my U.S. passport card in my wallet, knowing full well that I'm not going to be profiled, but I'm terrified of being treated or being suspected of being an other. If I open my pocketbook in a store to get my glasses out, I go in the middle of the aisle and very conspicuously open my purse to get my thing, to make sure that people don't think that I'm stealing something. That should not be there. I've been in this country most of my life. I've been here for 41 years, but it's so embedded in me that I am the other, that I do not belong. And these are subtle signs, and they are
you finding,
are visual too.
Okay, we're counting down rapidly, and I'm going to ask you in the second part of our program, which is, of course, on Facebook and social media, about possible solutions. But let me ask if, just very quickly, if you feel that this time is different than any other time that we've experienced over the years. If just very quickly, Clarence, very quickly.
Yes, I do think it's different. I think, as Ivan points out, while there's been that long history, there's never been a moment where whites thought that they would basically lose power. But with these demographic projections that are being that have been put out in the last 20 years or so, you begin to see that. The latest poll show a third of people in the country, a third of Americans believe in this replacement theory of some sort. And when you break that down by party, you're probably talking over a majority of Republicans.
Well,
I think we're in a very different era.
You are indeed. I want to thank all of you. This has been an extraordinary broadcast, and that's the end of our show. And I want to thank you for joining us, but stay with us as we continue our conversation on our digital platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Phillip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. We're on Facebook and YouTube with our post show, continuing our discussion on the rise of race-based violence, hate, and discrimination. We saw this situation in Buffalo, the killing of 10 African Americans, 12 people killed altogether, and they were purposely targeted because of the color of their skin. This, of course, took place at a supermarket, people going about their day, thinking that they were picking up milk and groceries and things for their mothers and fathers, and in one case, a father shopping for his 3-year-old kid. And we've all experienced the trauma of this week. Wondering, just picking up what we were talking about before, if how all of you were just personally affected. I was just emotionally distraught over this. And I'm just wondering if how you felt. Eva, how did it impact you?
Well, it just brought back to my conscious that there's no safe spaces anymore. There's you're not safe in a store, you're not safe in your own church, you're not safe anywhere for a person of color. And that is pretty scary, that concept. And
Sandra?
Yeah, there is, again, as a trauma psychologist, I hear trauma stories all day long, and hearing this, I always think about the parents and what parents are going through, and how do they feel every time they let their kids out of that door, and how scared they feel for their lives, and how unfair to live life like that. It is so disheartening and scary, very scary.
Clarence, you must have been in class this week, and how did your students react, and how were you impacted?
So we actually have finished, but like a lot of people, when these events occur, the first things you do is, if you know somebody from that area or you have family, you make the call. You just don't know, and information is coming in. I called a good friend of mine who I knew was from Buffalo. It turns out that 3 of the individuals who were killed were relatives of hers. Needless to say, she was devastated. I was devastated. And Sandra is absolutely right. You hug your kids tighter. You may be thousands of miles away. You step a little bit more cautiously. It's unavoidable that we all are traumatized by these events.
Iván.
It's heartbreaking, and my condolences, Dr. Luzon, that this tragedy hit so close to home. That is just heartbreaking, and adding even more trauma to a situation that is already awful. The notion of being hunted down is something that people of color have experienced and continue to experience. And it is frankly irresponsible that law enforcement has not done enough to protect people of color, knowing full well that there are real threats out there. The person in Buffalo was known to law enforcement, had made statements that were deeply problematic about wanting to shoot people and kill people. And at the same time, it's as if we're not taking these things seriously. I am also particularly troubled by the fact that, and I might be exaggerating here a bit, but the apprehension of this suspect, not even a scratch, when in situations where law enforcement is encountering people who look like you, Philip, or who look like me, in situations that are far less volatile, the suspect doesn't even come out alive. And so the fact that we have here the use of de-escalation tactics and techniques for restraint that are never visited upon people of color, I shouldn't say never, but rarely visited upon people of color, is deeply problematic and illustrates the depth of disparities in our legal system.
Another concern that I have, and I think most people have, is also the designation or lack of the term terrorism when we're talking about incidents of this sort in the United States, whether it be the Tree of Life attack on a synagogue in Pittsburgh or the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. The lack of definition of, or the lack of, I should say, applicability of the term terrorism to these incidents, many people find deeply problematic. Returning to you, Iván, but also asking our entire panel, was this yet another act of terrorism from your point of view? But also, why do you think there's a legal, if you will, limitation to the application of that term domestically?
At Lawyers for Civil Rights, we absolutely believe that this was an act of domestic terrorism and of white nationalism and white supremacy in a violent manifestation, in a massacre. And this pivots, at least based on how we think about this at Lawyers for Civil Rights, institutionally, organizationally, on stereotypes of who those type of labels apply to. A terrorist in American imagination is somebody from the Middle East, not somebody who's white and suburban. And that notion, that disconnect between the reality is also problematic. We need to have a really robust conversation about how stereotypes and prejudice influence those labels.
And actually, I'm going to move on to just another aspect of this, which is the notion of otherliness. It's been amplified extraordinarily by Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you saw that extraordinary series in the New York Times on Tucker Carlson, and the power he has to amplify hate. And his ratings have surged every time he talks about Great Replacement or white people being victimized in the United States, his ratings surge. And the question then becomes, how is that impacting communities of color, those people who are replacing, quote unquote, white Americans, again, people from the El Salvador and Nicaragua and from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, you name it. Eva, how are you seeing this playing out within immigrant communities, or the impact on immigrant communities, especially in terms of asylum claims?
Well, I think, this is asylum. The asylum process per se is very complicated to begin with. And then, to add all this extra layer of racism and xenophobia is going to make it even harder to qualify for asylum. And then, we have the lack of compassion that our country has towards those other countries of color that have faced or are facing the same issues that the white counterparts are facing, yet we refuse to acknowledge them and their issues. So when we have somebody that Tucker calls on feeding people their daily dose of hatred, to begin with, this is a racist society from the get-go. So what do you expect?
So let me try to turn this around a bit and see if we can focus on possible solutions or ways of addressing this promulgation of otherliness. But let me just first of all say perhaps a bit of bad news. There's a chance that Donald Trump or a Donald Trump-like character, Ron DeSantis, for example, people who are heavily invested in making white people fear for their lives and their country and or what they perceive as their country. But there's a good chance that one of these folks will run in 2024 and a chance that one of them will be elected. Along with them comes individuals like Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller has long, who was the former advisor to the president of immigration, long a proponent of replacement theory based on his reading list and based on those who he has acquainted himself with over the years, allied himself with, I should say. What happens next? What do you do? How do you prepare for 2024 in the context of what we're dealing with right now, including mounting anti-Black and anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish violence, transphobia, so on and so forth? Starting with Sandra, and then we'll go to Eva, Clarence, and then to Iván.
Well, you have to think, whose responsibility it is to dismantle this racist system? Is it the responsibility of people of color, or is it the responsibility of white people? We need to start there. Unfortunately, I don't think that many white people out there will take this responsibility. And so it falls on people of color to dismantle these systems. And that adds yet an extra layer of exhaustion to their daily lives, right? In dealing with this. I would say, at the clinic, we are constantly educating people around what are some of the issues that refugees face in terms of barriers to their care and barriers in systemic barriers, and also training the justice system. Soon we'll some of us will engage into some trainings to some of the immigration judges around how to be more culturally responsive. And creating also raising awareness on the impact of racism in individuals' lives and the mental health, because it is a mental mental health issue that we need. It's extremely important issue in when you are thinking about the health and healthcare. And voting, I would encourage people to keep voting, to go out and vote, have their voices out there. It's frustrating. It's very frustrating. We had
but you have cited some concrete issues. Some concrete responses, rather.
What's that?
And that's appreciated. Eva, what's your view? One of the things Sandra mentioned is voting, but you're also seeing massive voter prohibitions taking place in state after state, and you also see where immigrants, those who aren't, who don't vote, but are being accused of basically lining up in polls in New Hampshire, in Maine, falsely accused. What are the next steps that you believe have to be taken in order to lift a curtain on bigotry in the lead up to 2024?
Well, I am a big believer in building bridges, and that's what I'm doing right now at the White Mountains. I go and I talk to law enforcement about diversity. I don't give them a training. I just talk about different perspectives and where we grow up with and what it is. I think, and it is a tedious job, but somebody's got to do it. I talk to them. I use the fact that I'm a police commissioner in Manchester to open doors in places where there's no, like today they told me there's no diversity here. I said, I know that, but as diversity starts growing in the States, you're going to come across people that do things in a different way. That doesn't mean that they're criminals. That doesn't mean that, and just build relationships. I go to the churches and I put together an immigration one-on-one presentation to help those people in defense about immigration, to educate them. But the hatred speaks always louder than our allies. And I have to, I always tell our allies, I challenge them and say, don't stay silent. You have to speak as loud, because otherwise we do not have any, visually we do not have any allies if you do not bother to speak up. Use your white privilege, if you will, to make sure that other white people listen to you, because it takes me 10 years to build one relationship, that you in 5 minutes can solve.
Eva, thank you very much. Clarence, in the lead up to 2024, this wall that's being built metaphorically and physically on the border and in across the United States, that is a lot of the building blocks include extraordinarily racist ideology. How do you counter that?
So that's an excellent question. So I think there are 3 areas I will look at. One is public policy. Ivan knows extremely well that you really have to have policies and laws in place to begin to address these issues. So the whole point of voting is to elect people that will push through the public policy that can begin to move the country in the right direction. So we have to see all of that as linked and continue to fight on that level. We also need to address these issues as they have manifested in the media. The media, including social media, has been absolutely essential in the spread and in the amplification of white nationalism, white supremacist ideology. And what we see now is that these extremists, they go into these acts, knowing that they can streamline, that they can broadcast these horrific kinds of activities. And so there's responsibility from Facebook to Instagram to all of the social media to address that. And then I would also agree with my colleagues, education is critical. The attacks on civil critical race theory, 1619 Project, all of that serves the purpose of creating the foundations for these mythical views of American history that then line up with these white nationalist projections. And so we've got to support teachers and educators who really do see the need for diversity and an education system that's broad and inclusive.
Thank you, Clarence. And librarians, I would add to your list as well.
And librarians,
for example.
Absolutely.
Iván, you get the last word on this. What's next? How do we prepare, counter what's happening right now around the country that is really a prelude, many believe, to the politics that will precede 2024?
Well, the myth that you are pointing to, which I would summarize as this perception that people who look different from you are coming for your livelihood. That is a myth that we need to continue to counter through the type of legal action that we do at Lawyers for Civil Rights, but also changing hearts and minds. And I actually am very, very hopeful. I am hopeful for learning with and from each other across differences. I'm hopeful for building bridges across political and cultural differences. We have seen significant change over the past few years. And yes, we are experiencing growing pains, but I feel that we will come out of this stronger, more united, more aligned across differences. There are brighter days ahead. And even though we have things like the Buffalo Massacre happening right now, I think these are opportunities to re-emphasize the importance, for example, of law enforcement investigation and deeper commitment of resources in that arena. And so we need to make sure that we are moving forward deliberately and intentionally across differences to make sure we are not making the same mistakes again and again. And so, if anything, what I want to express is absolutely my deep faith and conviction in how we can grow, change as a society and as a country. And for that, I am hopeful.
And I can't overstate how important it is to be hopeful in considering the enormity of what we're dealing with. Well, folks, that's it for this program. And I want to thank our panelists, Sandra, Eva, Clarence, Iván. And if you didn't know, now you know. I'm Phillip Martin. This is Basic Black. Thank you.